Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Gesha Carbonic Macerated Processed Ethiopia from Pale Coffee. And there's the container right there. And Pale, based out of Kraków, Poland. And this is their second ever appearance on this channel, having recently reviewed the Juan Carlos Velez, a wash-processed Ecuadorian coffee. And one quick housekeeping note when it comes to this coffee, I don't know what this coffee actually is, as they only have Gesha listed on the label itself. They do have a QR code on the top of the container, and I did scan that QR code and it originally took me to the website itself. And on the website, they did have a Uraga coffee, which also matched the processing of this one. So it's entirely possible that that is the coffee that we are working with. However, that coffee is now gone from their website, and I can't be 100% sure that it is the same coffee that we are reviewing right here. So for the purposes of this review, we're just calling this one Gesha, which is what they have on the label itself. Now, in our previous Pale review, I mentioned that I enjoyed the first couple of experiences of that coffee so much that I did go back and pick out a second coffee from this coffee roaster. And that is, of course, this one right here. As I've mentioned in the past, that when trying out a roaster for the first time, I like to review one of their washed and one of their non-washed offerings. And this one sounded like the nicest non-washed offering that they did have at the coffee shop at that time. So we went ahead and picked it up, and it'll be interesting to see how it turned out, as this right here is day 54. And recipe we went with for this coffee was the same as our previous Pale coffee review, which was a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 90 degrees Celsius, about 194 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which usually indicates a more medium fine grind. However, with this coffee, we went a little bit more coarse on the grind with this one as well. Now, roast profile of this coffee is also kind of interesting because this one was significantly more developed than the other coffee that we did review from them. Now, once again, they do have filter and espresso roast offerings, so I do wonder if this one happened to be one of their espresso offerings, as it's not listed anywhere on the label, so there's no way of being able to tell for sure. It's entirely possible that it's just a result of the processing that is on this coffee, but that being said, it did turn out a little bit more on the developed side of what we would associate with a medium light, and verging pretty close to a medium by most standards and metrics. So again, could just be the profile of coffee that we picked out. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 25, first impression through the V60, and that was definitely the first takeaway that I did have, was that this coffee was significantly more robust than the Juan Carlos Velez that we were also working on, as it's not known what direction that they took this coffee, as it's entirely possible it's a result of the processing or that it's an espresso roast, and I mentioned that, but that's also the first takeaway that I did have, as it seemed to hinder the coffee with a notable heavy quality to it and a heavier berry sense as well. So certainly not necessarily the best first impression, and given that I had some pretty high hopes for this coffee, it definitely didn't lend itself towards that. Day 28 through the Chemex, and the coffee was a bit better this time around, as it was cleaner and offering better definition, with still a combination of the heavier berry and more robust qualities to it. Also a little bit of some floral qualities presented in a red sense, which I would define as being maybe reminiscent of either hibiscus or a rose, given the strong red qualities to this one. It does cool off into a more even finish, so I found the finish of this coffee to be a bit better than the intermediary or start, so improvement I would say on the second try. Day 31 through the UFO brewer, and the coffee was a little better, as it does have better definition to some of the heavier berry qualities to it, and a better defined florality as well, so this coffee does seem to be improving in terms of the clarity. A slight bitterness that I would say was reminiscent of vanilla, but outside of that, there's a bit of roastiness nonetheless. So first couple of impressions, obviously going through the motions, not necessarily finding too many qualities that I was enjoying, but some potential for some of the characteristics. And on day 34, we opted for the V60 with significantly lower extraction adjustments. So I said that this coffee is so heavy and so roasty that I'm going to tone this one down significantly. Went all the way down to 90 degrees Celsius at a 15:1. And very surprisingly, this coffee was actually extremely clean and well defined, especially for what it was. There's still a slightly robust feel. However, it also offered a lovely fruit forward feel in a very peachy sense. Outside of that, there's a better defined florality to this one, as it feels significantly improved from the earlier days, and I'll kind of spoil this. This day was an anomaly. I was never able to replicate this experience, as none of the other days we're going to have from this point going forward were anywhere near as good as this one was. You could have convinced me that I was drinking a more processed, or I should say, a more developed wash-processed Ethiopian coffee on this day based off of the results that we did have. It was just that clean and well-defined in the fruit sense. Day 37. Through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it certainly didn't translate as well through this brew method, as the brightness was a bit more uneven and more of the robust heaviness to it. Outside of that, there's still some of the earlier robust qualities, fermented qualities of this coffee with less definition to the previously mentioned fruit components to it. Day 41 through the V60 with the same adjustments, and it was not quite as impressive as the previous time brewing this coffee with this brew method, as it's still a little heavier and more robust with an overly intense sense to it and some very subtle traces of the stone fruits present yet again, but not to the same level of definition and clarity that it had been on the previous try. Day 44 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it's a little better than the previous Chemex day, but neither of our recent experiences have replicated the same success we did have on that day 34 mark, as the processing is felt in a long-lasting sense. There are traces of some cleaner stone fruit and honeyed qualities in the intermediary, but even then, nowhere near as it had been on the previous try. Day 47, final notes we have through the V60 with those same lower extraction adjustments, and it's a lot closer to that day 34 mark with a slight bit more of a fresh fruit quality to it. Otherwise, still a bit robust, still a focus on the heavier berry components to it, and this time around a prominent savory spiced black tea feel with a strong perfumey florality to accompany it as well. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through it. We will start with the finished level 4, and we'll probably discuss that alongside the sweetness, which is also their level 4. That does indicate that this coffee never got to the point where it was overbearing. Granted, we toned it down about as much as I feel comfortable toning down any coffee between the recipe that we did offer, the grind setting, everything along those lines. So it's possible that maybe if we had kept this one at some more moderate or higher level extraction, then we could have gotten a much more intense and overbearing quality to it. But no, both of them are level 4, largely because it does present in a more even sense. The sweetness, it's mostly in that kind of heavier berry quality, so it's still justified at the level 4 mark, even if it isn't necessarily the best defined sweetness to it. Acidity, level 4. It does have a little bit of that slightly more boozy, bright, acidic quality to it as well, and that's usually associated with more processed coffees. I feel like these heavier processed coffees, something like a carbonic macerated processed coffee, usually seems to go very heavy in that direction in an uneven sense, and we were able to keep that one toned down as well. Honestly, if we push this coffee, I fully imagine that all three of those things do score a level 5, and that's probably the direction that some people might have taken this coffee. Berry fruit, level 4. Same thing with that one. I feel like if we push this coffee, it's probably scoring a level 5 for that, but it did have some cleaner characteristics to it. I can definitely see a lot of those red berry qualities, also some of those darker berry. I often associate these more processed fermented qualities to be reminiscent of grape, so a heavier grape characteristic to this one. Citrus fruit, level 4. Don't have a great descriptor for that, as it definitely didn't have terrific definition to the citric qualities of this one. I would say that they were kind of along the lines of that very bright acidity that we did have within this coffee. All right, then we have a bunch of level 3s. We will start with the florality level 3. Kind of an interesting one to me, given the strong perfumey florality to it, also the previously mentioned red qualities, red tint to this coffee. But even then, I would say that just the more heavier qualities of this one were abundant in comparison to the florality, so level 3 where we opted to put that. Stone fruit level 3. On the one day, that day 34 mark, I could see this one being at a level 4 and a lot of the other characteristics in this coffee being toned down, but that's not the case with the last time we brewed it. A little bit closer to that level 3 mark, so that's where we opted to put it. Chocolate level 3. Definitely a bit more of that traditional heavier characteristic in that dark chocolate-like sense, so it's scoring pretty high, I think, is another representation of the roasty qualities that we were getting from this coffee. Savoriness, level 3. I mentioned, what was the savory quality? That kind of spiced black tea towards the end, which the spice is also there at that level 3 mark. Pretty abundant within this coffee, and once again, not necessarily a characteristic that I was looking for, and it kind of went against the fruit qualities of this coffee, so not necessarily my favorite in that sense. Body level 3, definitely plenty of texture to this one as well, and I think that was probably a bit more expected with this coffee, and kind of surprising that it was even to the Juan Carlos Velez given what both of these coffees are, but even then, plenty of body, medium texture to this one. And then the final thing we're discussing, certainly the most important thing, the cleanliness level 3. I think that's a win. I mean, it's a carbonic macerated natural processed coffee, and I've said in the past, I've never liked anything carbonic macerated whatsoever. So with that scoring there at the level 3 mark, not being lower than that, I will take that as a very big win. Even the one day that we did brew it, it would have been a bit of that day 34 mark, it would have been a bit of a stretch to put it all the way there at the level 4 mark, given the roasty qualities of this coffee. But given that there's heaviness, fermentiness, and a roastiness to it, having it score that at level 3 is definitely a victory, largely because I was able to get some definition to the honeyed qualities, the floral qualities, the fruit qualities to it. So that's a win. And outside of that, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. It couldn't have been more different than the experience that I did have with that Juan Carlos Velez, and I really don't know what happened. I really want to revisit this coffee roaster, maybe with something that I have a little bit more information on, largely because I felt like I was working in the dark with both of these coffees. This one even more so than the Juan Carlos Velez. I had no information on that coffee, and I didn't even know which coffee this one was, so there's a lot to be, taken away from the results that we did have based off of these two coffees. I mean, they're about as opposite as I've an experience as I've had of any coffee roaster when trying them out for the first time. As one was very light, this one was definitely not. One was a little bit cleaner and more tame, and this one was not. So yeah, two completely different, and that's the main reason why we like to do one wash and one non-wash coffee, because you can kind of see both sides of the spectrum. But even then, I didn't expect to see both sides of the spectrum to be as different as they were. I didn't particularly like this coffee, but once again, I don't particularly like anything carbonic macerated, so that's not too surprising. If I could have replicated that day 34 mark throughout the entirety of this one, then I would have had maybe one of my favorite carbonic macerated processed coffees, but even then, I really don't know what happened on that specific day. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. We'll start with the heaviness of this one because you have to enjoy the more heavier qualities of a coffee like this. So heavier fermenty grape-like characteristics, those heavier fermenty berry qualities to it with some traces of cleaner peach characteristics, still plenty of sweetness, still plenty of intensity, if not in an overbearing sense. So keep that in mind. Also, the more developed qualities of this one, and that's kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this coffee and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee or know more information about this coffee, I'd love to hear your thoughts, impressions, or info on that as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Gesha Carbonic Macerated Processed Ethiopia from Pale Coffee. Thank you for watching.